So we finished the first. So now we left off with Constantine coming to power and winning the battle of the Milvian Bridge, the edict that freed Christianity and put an end to persecution. So what we have left for the Roman Empire is, of course, we have. Remember, it was divided into four pieces. So we have Constantine, who is occupying the west, right? And then you have Licinius, and then you have, is it Maxentius? Make sure I'm spelling it right. No, Maximinus. Maxentius is the one that Constantine conquered. Maximinus. And remember, these things are not as critical. I'm just telling you a story. I mean, it's true, but I'm not worried about you gathering these sorts of things. I'm just trying to set the stage for what is to come. They made the pact, right? The Edict of Milan, which put an end to persecution between Constantine and Licinius. That empire-wide, there'd be no more persecution of Christians. It was shortly after that that they both invaded Maximinus and took him out. So now you have the empire redistributed into two parts again, the west and the east. And they seemed to be content with keeping it like this, but secretly, Constantine wanted the whole thing, and secretly, Licinius also wanted the whole thing. So it would not take a long time for them to begin to fight each other. But the truth is that both Licinius and Constantine sought to rule the whole empire, which in spite of its vastness was too small for the two of them. The peace between the two of them lasted until 322, when Constantine invaded Licinius. And the stakes of the war were the entire Roman Empire. At this point, Constantine would invade Licinius' territory. He'd invade the east, and he would be armed, of course, with his famous, you guys remember what it was called? Chi Rho. It was the symbol now. He had a great victory, right? So he adopted it and invaded Licinius' territory. And eventually, after many battles, Licinius would abdicate his position for the sparing of his life, and this would leave Constantine as the sole ruler of the empire. And then he would rule the empire from 322 till his death in 337. And it's really hard to understate how much of a change and how drastic of an impact this would have upon the world and upon the church. The public embrace of Christianity by a Roman emperor, namely Flavius Valerius Constantius, otherwise known as Constantine I, in the second decade of the 4th century AD, had such far-reaching effects that by the time he died, there was scarcely any facet of the public life of the empire or that of the church that was not impacted by his policy of official Christianization. So, it's said that even now we are feeling the effects of Constantine, and it is true. So, Constantine would come to power, and he would have a desire, the same kind of desire that men like Decius and Diocletian would have. And do you remember what that desire was? What do they want to do for Rome? They wanted to return Rome to its former glory, right? Rome had been was on the point of collapsing, and they were trying to resurge it and fix it and bring it back to its world power, domination, and glory that it was. Okay, but how did Diocletian and Decius do that? They returned to who? Yeah, they persecuted Christians. Why did they persecute the Christians, though? Because they were trying to return to the pagan gods. Yeah, they wanted to please the pagan gods. So the Christians were obviously very much against the pagan gods. So they said, we are going to have to kill these Christians if we are going to accomplish our goal of returning Rome to its former glory. So Constantine had the same desire, but how did he approach it? He approached it by making Christianity by bringing Rome away from paganism and more towards a Christian nation. He sought to bring this about with the aid of Christianity. He faced an uphill battle with his pro-Christian rhetoric, and this battle was the Roman Senate, who were all very still staunchly pagan. So it wasn't as if at that time Rome simply just flipped on a switch and became Christian. There were still many facets of Rome that were very deeply pagan, and Christianity would be like a seed that would germinate and sprout and grow throughout the empire. So to try to get people on board with his new vision for Rome, Constantine would decide to make a new capital for Rome. And that capital is what he would call Constantinople, right? Constantinople, city of Constantine. And he would decide to build Constantinople, and this would get people on board with the new direction for Rome. Now, as absolute master of the empire, he set out on a bold course. He would build a new Rome, an impregnable and monumental city, which would be called Constantinople, that is, the city of Constantine. And this is where we begin to see the blending of Constantine's loyalties, okay? Let me just say this right now. Constantine is a very debated figure in church history, okay? There's going to be people who are very, very pro-Constantine, who say that almost all of his motives were done well, and he was obviously very fresh in the faith and made a lot of mistakes, but he truly was regenerated and was believing in Christ. And then there are going to be some who say that he was simply just a political person who did not truly believe in the faith. But I think what would be helpful, and I'm kind of giving away my position here, is that it's probably somewhere in between the two, right? Where Constantine was being regenerated out of a staunchly pagan past. He was a man of great power who had great influence. So this would be hard for him to put himself under certain teachers. He did more for Nicene Christianity than what we can possibly imagine. He also did more for Arian Christianity than we can possibly imagine. And he did a lot of pagan things as well. So there's a very great debate on what Constantine was like. Okay, so he's going to build Constantinople, and this will unite the country. And this is where we see a blending of his Christian loyalties. On the one hand, he was appealing to the Christian masses. He was going to build the city in a way that would be very anti-pagan. He would raid the pagan temples to bring the riches from the pagan temples to his new city. He would desecrate the statues, the idols, and replace them with his own head, which was interesting. But it was very in some ways, it could be interpreted being very anti-pagan. But he also did it in a way that the pagans could get on board with it, and he did it in a way that the Christians could get on board with it. And how I could describe this is, as they were walking around the perimeter of the city where Constantine wanted the walls built, he was walking and they were following him, and they kept asking him, Constantine, how far are we going to walk? How big do you want the city to be? And he would say, however big he wants it to be. Now, so as a Christian, who do you think he's referring to? God, right? But as a pagan, what could he be referring to? Yeah, the gods, right? So he did these sorts of things where, it could be interpreted in two ways. Now was he meaning to do it in that way? I don't know. Or was he only referring to God? Was he referring to God and then allegorically referring to the pagans? No, I was joking. Back to the origin idea. No, I don't know, right? I don't know. But he did. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, okay. So as he was walking around the land where the city would be built, he was walking the perimeter and he was telling the builders where to build the wall. And Constantinople was a massive city. So they kept asking him, Constantine, how much farther are we going to go? How much bigger does this city need to be? And he kept telling them, as big as he wants it to be. So as big as the gods want it to be, right? The sun, as big as the sun wants it to be, right? And we could think of sun as Jesus, or the unconquerable son was it Septimus Severus or Decius? It was Decius who referred to the unconquerable son, right? So, pagans can get on board with that, Christians can get on board with that, and they were going to build a city together, though they hated each other.
Does it mean that he was like a politician?
So yeah, that's an interpretation of him. Was he a politician? Now we'll actually get to that in a second. But the question is did they do politics the same way back then as we do today, or is it anachronistic to think of the idea of a ruler trying to appeal to the people? Right? He was already emperor, right? But you wanted to keep your people happy. And then if he was appealing if he was trying to be a politician appealing to the Christians, why would you appeal to the Christians? These were the lowliest of the low. There were not very many that were rich. They were hated by most of the empire. So why would he appeal to this small sect though it was a very rapidly growing sect? Maybe he saw that, as maybe he guessed correctly. I don't know. Yeah, it's very difficult to understand, okay? But we'll talk a little bit more, and maybe I can give a little more guidance as to how to think about it. But I would really recommend at some point and personally I need to do it as well, doing some more study on Constantine and his. If you're really interested in church history, I think this is a topic that needs to be studied more deeply. He says, as far as the one who walks before me does. So how far are we going to walk, Constantine? As far as the one who walks before me does. So, what is he referring to? The city was massive, and he would decorate Constantinople with the riches of the empire. This would include a 125-foot tall statue of the god Apollo, but instead of Apollo's head, it was adorned with Constantine's head. And what he did to get people to move to Constantinople was he offered many different incentives to move to Constantinople, including tax-free living. So he wanted Rome to embrace this new vision, and that sounds pretty good, right? And lots of people moved there to the point where they had to actually expand the walls because it was not big enough. Let's talk a little. We've been kind of talking about it a little bit. But let's talk about Constantine's conversion. The first idea is that the early church came away with, because even the early church were divided on what to think about Constantine. You had two categories. The first one was that this was God's victory for the church. Imagine that the emperor who has for so long been persecuting the Christians, has declared himself to be a Christian, or at least pro-Christian, and now he is freeing us from our oppression, and he is instituting pro-Christian ideas, and this seems like it could be the will of God for the victory of the church. That is a plausible idea. The second one is that Constantine was a politician, simply leveraging power and trying to posture correctly to bring people into unity with his vision. And my idea, and it's also the opinion of this guy, Justo Gonzalez, is that there's probably a mixture of the two that is happening. The problems that you would say against the view that he's posturing. When he put the Cairo on his labarum, he was preparing to go to battle for the city of Rome, center of pagan traditions, where his main supporters were the members of the old aristocracy who considered themselves oppressed by Maxentius. So when he did that, it was not a popular idea, right? It was not as if there was a whole bunch of Christians who wanted him to do that. Okay? So where is the political merit in that is the question. And then, and that's what I've said before. Who were these Christians anyway? What sort of political gain could they offer? The problems against his true conversion are that he was never put under a bishop, so he was never receiving any sort of ongoing preaching of the word from a bishop. He had multiple bishops that came into his court that were his advisors, but they weren't in a sort of pastoral role in his life. He reserved the right to overrule his bishops, so that's problematic, right? He wasn't baptized until his deathbed, and he was baptized by an Arian on his deathbed, Eusebius of Nicomedia. And he also took the pagan rites during his life. So the pagan rituals, he continued to do the pagan rituals. So, what are we to think about Constantine? It's probably the case that Constantine was overwhelmed with and impressed by the victory that he had in the name of God. The truth is probably that Constantine was a sincere believer in the power of Christ, but this does not mean that he understood the power in the same way in which had been experienced by those Christians who had died for it. What I'm going to submit to you is that Constantine was regenerated, but it was a very progressive and slow process, one that lasted even until his death. So at first, he ended persecution. So that's one step, right, in pro-Christian ideas. Then he started giving favor to the bishops and the church. This is where he would give for the Council of Nicaea, or calling the Council of Nicaea for one. But he ordered the Roman soldiers to protect the bishops as they traveled to the council. So he wanted the church to be protected. He was growing resentful of paganism. In 324, he issued an edict ordering all soldiers to worship the supreme God on Sunday. But of course, that could be interpreted as the unapproachable sun, right? The unapproachable sun, or the unconquerable sun, right? The god that Decius worshipped. In 325, he oversaw the first ecumenical council of the church, the Council of Nicaea. And then, of course, offered the protection of the bishops to come there and back. Ordered it, right? He commanded that it be done. And then he raided the pagan temples to build Constantinople. But was he desiring the riches of the pagan temples to adorn his new city, or was he raiding the temples because he wanted to do away with the temples? He never ended paganism. That wouldn't come until Theodosius, shortly after the Council of Constantinople. So there's that to be said. In spite of all this, when he died, the Roman Senate declared him to be a god, and he was enshrined as a god. So he's a god of paganism. But then, what is also ironic, thus the ironic anomaly occurred that Constantine, who had done so much to the detriment of paganism, became one of the pagan gods, And then to compound the irony, the Eastern Church considers him to be a saint. So he is a saint of the Eastern Church, and he is a god of the pagan church. So I think that's a beautiful metaphor for the confusion of who Constantine was. Yeah, and he was declared to be a god by the pagans, and of course, could Constantine have said no to that? Well, he was dead, right? But his sons were still alive, and his sons did not say anything. They were okay with it. But you will see that his sons did not exactly see eye to eye with their dad on a lot of things, actually. The problem with that is the father of church history, Eusebius of Caesarea, was very pro-Constantine, and he knew him personally. So, when we trust Eusebius, but then there were men who did not appreciate Constantine. So therein lies the difficulty, is the faithful Christians and the time that it was happening were split. So who do you trust, right? Are you going to trust the pro-Constantine ones, or are you going to trust the anti-Constantine Christians? Yeah, real quick, we'll go to you.
Is it important to know if he's a believer or not for us?
Well, it's just an interesting question, I think, and ultimately, it's not one that must be answered. It's not one that cannot be answered, in my opinion, definitively. But I think it is it's a topic of if you're going to give yourself to church history, I think you need to spend time considering what happened to Constantine. A church father is one who was a leader in the church, did many writings that benefited the church, was in the church. So these are the types of things that a church father is. And Haken gives a very helpful definition of church fathers in your book, and you'll see that we would not consider Constantine to be a church father. Yeah. And I don't think anybody would consider, even the pro-Constantine people, they would not consider him to be a church father. Yeah. That's kind of where I'm at. I'm on the fence of it. But I mean, it's really hard to deny how he has influenced the church. I mean, the fact that we meet in a church building and not like in people's homes or at the gravesides of martyrs, that's a Constantine idea, right? To have a church building in the city, right? To replace the temple, the pagan temples. So we are, in a lot of ways, standing on what Constantine has done for the church. So it is a question that I think needs to be wrestled with. Any other questions? Here's my best advice to you on this topic, okay? Go into it with an open mind and study it for yourself, okay? If you are very torn on it and you want to know more, I think you should read Lightheart, okay? And I think you should read. I can find another book that's on the other side of it, and just hear the arguments for yourself. I don't want you to come away from this thinking that I'm giving you a position on Constantine. I am not prepared in my own study to give a position on Constantine, except that you should study it with an open mind. That's my humble submission to you. Does that make sense? Any questions, thoughts? I, for one, am very excited to read Lightheart's book on Constantine when I get some time. Okay. The church under Constantine. So what happened to the church under Constantine? It had a massive effect on the church, okay? Like the conversion of Constantine, you could put it in quotes if you want to, the conversion of Constantine, I would not put it in quotes. It was muddled as well with positive and negative things. So the church was positively affected by Constantine, but I think in some ways the church was also negatively affected by Constantine. And it's the same way with persecution, right? Is the church positively affected by persecution? Yes. Is it negatively affected by persecution? Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So is Constantine just another thing like that? Yeah, could be. From the time of Constantine to Theodosius, there's going to be a time of constant battling between the Christians and the pagans. So from Constantine to Theodosius, and Theodosius came to power late 4th century, so 60 years or whatever it is. From Constantine to Theodosius, there's going to be, and Theodosius is the one who finally made it illegal to be a pagan. So it closed the temples, stopped the sacrifices, all those things. And he's also the emperor who instituted the Council of Constantinople. But I'm getting ahead of myself. And what was tragic about this battle between the pagans and the Christians is that there were a lot of Christians who began to, in some ways, return the favor upon the pagans for the persecution of them. So they would raid the temples. There were battles. There were killings done. This is not exactly the most. It's not completely clean. The Christians were not completely good in all the things that they did. Right? They got a little bit too overboard with it. Let's see here. The impact. There's no more persecution. Church bishops were tax exempt. It was now legal to give property to the church. So you could give property to the church, and then that property would be tax exempt. The clergy were exempt from, as I said, taxes, military conscription, and public works. There was beginning to be some legislation on personal conduct. So there were certain laws that were being put into place to bolster like sexual morality and things like that. The gladiatorial games still existed, still happened under Constantine, and what is very tragic, a really tragic idea of this is that they even began to be attended by some of the Christians, which is when you think about the history of it, it's very tragic. Sunday worship was decreed and was made easier to worship because it was required that you worship on Sunday. So businesses would close and people could go to church on Sunday. And the worship service was complicated after Constantine, was given an imperial flavor. So Constantine was taking some of the ideas from the paganism and bringing them into Christianity. This is where bishops began to be called priests. They would have certain robes, these sorts of things. The garb and the altars, and this, of course, was in opposition to the Didache, which taught that the priest should wear normal clothes. It was not supposed to be any sort of fancy situation. Incense was used in the churches, and what, of course, was incense normally used in pagan times? It was used to worship the emperor, right? So they're bringing this pagan idea into the church. Kneeling for prayer on Sundays was instituted, and the idea of kneeling was a worshipful act towards the emperor, and now they were bringing it into the church. Choirs were, groups of people singing. Hymns were brought in, and what the effect of this had was that the congregation of the people had less and less to do in the service. So it was more of a come and see situation. And, I loved the service Sunday where it was very, very involved. The congregation was very involved in the worship. So you guys are getting and you're a part of a very, I think, biblical idea of how church is to be done, with the congregation singing, many different people coming to read scripture and to do announcements and etc. So it's supposed to be a very joint effort, right? A body, right? That is meeting together. Where this was more of a show or a come and see kind of idea. Churches began to be built where martyrs were buried, and this kind of gave the idea that you worship at the church and not you can worship God anywhere. So that was something that was helpful, but also could be unhelpful. And because they were elevating the status of the martyrs, the idea of venerating the martyrs and making them saints and the idea of relics came up, where these people who endured for the faith were were holier in some ways, and people desired to have a piece of them. So this was where that started to come up. So as Constantine did these things, there were just a number of people who came to become members of the church, and too many to be properly trained, properly catechumenized. So you had a lot of people who became members of the church, were baptized into the church, who were not properly trained or understanding of what they were being baptized into. So this is where you began to see what's the word I'm looking for? Not purity, impurity of the church. That's not the word I'm looking for, but it works. Constantine instituted the idea of a basilica, which is the church building, where the cathedra would be where the pastor would preach from. The idea of mosaics, right? Tile mosaics was a Constantinian idea, where you would create this work of art that would depict some sort of scriptural idea in the church. That was Constantinian. And the baptistry was a Constantinian idea. And communion, thankfully, the Eucharist continued as traditional. And if you feel conflicted on Constantine, that's okay, because the early church was very conflicted on Constantine as well.